Hey everybody, this is Sarah Braun. I've chosen to do my project on the effects of the implementation of social stories on students with autism. I specifically chose this project because currently I'm trying to understand more about social stories and how to implement them in my classroom most effectively with my students. Here is a video of me reading a social story to one of my students this week. So, what are social stories? Social stories are primarily used for students with autism. We all know that deficits in language and social interaction are two very defining characteristics of students with autism. These two characteristics not only impede the child's development, but can lead to social withdrawal and isolation, which can in turn lead to peer rejection and behaviors that develop from that. In a social story, it will describe the aspects of a specific social situation that a child may find challenging. The social story will then explain the likely reactions of others in the situation and provide information about appropriate social response. A variety of researchers led by Carol Gray have developed a sort of framework for how a social story should look. It should have four basic types of sentences. One, a descriptive sentence that provides factual information. Two, a directive sentence which provides information on what the reader is to do. Three, a perspective sentence which provides the thoughts and feelings of others. And lastly, affirmative, which reassures the readers. She also states that there is a ratio that should be used in this story, meaning that there should be 2 to 4 descriptive, perspective, and or affirmative sentences for every 0 to 1 directive sentence. This means that for every directive sentence in the story, there will be at least 2 to 5 other sentences. This is so that we are not merely directing the child's behavior, but also describing the situation. Social stories can be used for a variety of purposes. Gray recognizes numerous uses for social stories, including explaining routines or changes in routines, describing social situations in a way that is non intimidating, teaching academic skills, teaching social skills, teaching adaptive skills, and dealing with difficult behaviors, including emotional aggression or obsessive behavior. So let's get into the research. My first article was written by Monica Delano and Martha Snell. This experiment was on the duration of appropriate social engagement in 3 elementary age students with autism. The social skills that were focused on were seeking attention, initiating comments, initiating requests, and making contingent responses. So, what'd they do? Their intervention included reading individualized social stories, answering comprehension questions, and participating in a 10-minute play session. Each child with autism was paired with a typical developing same age peer for the intervention sessions, and then they were paired with a second peer for the generalization probes in the Gen Ed classroom. During the first intervention session, the students were brought into a recess area and the experimenter read them the story. At the conclusion of the story, the author asked the student 4 or 5 comprehension questions. When the child could correctly answer at least 75% of the questions, both children were instructed to go to the play area. The instructor did no intervention during this time. After 15 sessions, when the social engagement was at least 40% greater than baseline, maintenance started. During maintenance, the social story was read only every other session for 6 sessions, and if social engagement remained at 40% or greater, then it moved every third session. If it remained at 40% or greater after that, then the social story was discontinued. If a participant's performance at any phase of the fading procedure fell below criterion, he was moved back a phase so that the intervention was implemented more frequently. Each time a student moved up a phase, he was also observed in the gen ed classroom during instruction time to see if the implementation generalized. So the results. The duration of engagement increased for all 3 students with both a training peer and a peer that was being used during gen ed sessions. The number of target social skills displayed during the 10-minute session increased after the intervention was introduced. The 2 kindergarten students were able to generalize the information to a classroom setting. However, the second grade student did not. These findings suggest that the use of social stories without additional social skill interventions may be effective in increasing the duration of social engagement and frequency of social skills. Our second article is based on 3 preschool age students by researchers Shannon Crozer and Matt Tincani. All 3 students were in a typical preschool classroom with 20 students, some with disabilities but mainly general ed students. All 3 students had different targeted behaviors for their social stories. The first student was being targeted for his time participating during circle time. The teacher set a goal of him sitting with the class for 10 minutes during morning meeting. The second student was targeted to engage with his peers during snack time. The third student's goal was to replace inappropriate play with appropriate play during block center. Each student received a specific social story to their targeted behavior. The social story was read immediately prior to the target activity and observation period. They were also asked comprehension questions and had to answer with 100% accuracy. The students whose goal it was to engage during snack time is the only one who got more than one intervention. When the intervention of just reading the story proved ineffective, by the end of the 10th session, a second intervention of social story plus verbal prompts was designed. He got an average of 2 prompts per minute. This proved to be effective. For maintenance, the researcher gave a fidelity checklist in the social story to the teacher who implemented the social stories. So the results. For the student whose targeted behavior was sitting on the carpet, there was an overall of 64% increase in the amount of time he sat appropriately at circle time from initial baseline to final intervention phase. For the student who was focusing on engaging during snack, his baseline of interacting with his peers was 0.2 times per session, an increase to 7.5. So an overall increase of 7.3 interactions per 10-minute snack time. Lastly, for the student who was interacting at blocks, his inappropriate behavior dropped an average of 1.8 times per session, and appropriate behaviors increased to 15.86 times per session. Lastly, our third study was conducted by Selda Ozdemir on 3 males between the ages of 7 and 9. Again, in this study, the 3 participants all received social stories based on their specific behaviors. The first student's targeted behavior was using a quiet voice. The second was a student who tips his chair backwards. Lastly, the third student's targeted behavior was waiting in line to get his lunch in the cafeteria. A difference in this study was that the students' own pictures depicting their problem behaviors were used in each page to capture the children's attention in the social stories. The last page of each story contained 2 pictures with a call out, such as "Nice work, James." 2 of the participants read their stories once in the morning and once in the afternoon. However, the student who was targeting waiting in line for lunch only read his 30 minutes before lunch. Fading began after 27 intervention sessions and when the percentage of disruptive behaviors was at least 47% lesser than baseline for 4 of the last 6 data points. When the participant met this criteria, the social story was rewritten by omitting the directive sentence. Reading it this way continued for 5 sessions. If the percentage of disruptive behavior remained at least 40% lesser than baseline for 4 of the last 5 data points, then Fade B started. During Fade B, the social story was read every other session. If the percentage of disruptive behaviors remained at least 40% lesser than baseline for 4 of the last 5 data points, then no story was read to the student. So the results. For the student who was focusing on using a quiet voice, his average raised voice was 62.9% of the time during the intervals. However, during intervention, it was only at an average 11.5. However, during fading, his average went back up to 29.36. For the student who was tipping his chair, he had an average of 55.4% during baseline, and during intervention phase, it was at 18.62%. With the story completely faded out, he was still at an average of only 20.93% of the time. For the last student who was targeting cutting in line and pushing other students, his average of performance was 60% during his observed time. His average during intervention was 7.68%. During fading, it went back up to an average of 20.31%. So what are my takeaways? There were dramatic changes in behaviors throughout all 3 articles. However, if you're going to implement social stories, you need to make sure to follow the guidelines with the ratio of 2 to 4 descriptive, perspective, or affirmative sentences for every 0 to 1 directive sentence. Remember, we are describing the situation, not directing the child's behavior. Also, it takes a lot of repeated practice and multiple times reading the story before you see the effects. It also has to be maintained. Also, there are multiple ways to be creative with the stories. Lastly, there might need to be other cues such as verbal or visual prompts to most effectively use the social story. I've learned so much from doing this research and I'm looking forward to implementing it in my classroom.